While the prosecution spoke in quiet, confident terms of victory, the defense hardly said a word. Nobody connected with the defense was making public statements or suggesting what new information they had. But Haynes occasionally leaked a juicy item. Race repeated what he had said in Fort Worth before the case was moved to Amarillo, that they would establish Davis's innocence by providing the name of the true killer. With the coming of Racehorse Haynes to Amarillo, there came also droves of reporters, cameramen, and artists. This was the part that Judge Dowland had dreaded. But now that it was actually happening in his own courtroom, the judge resolved to make the best of it. Haynes is a charming little cuss, Dowland was forced to admit. The judge knew of his reputation, but it was something else watching the man actually perform. Haynes could talk on his feet like a veteran actor reciting Shakespeare, forming complex motions, almost word perfect, and standing ready to back them up with a ton of law. By the second day of pretrial, the defense had filed almost 200 motions, asking Dowland to do everything from sequester the jury, which Dowland had already decided was necessary, to declare the state's capital murder law unconstitutional. Though it was true that the blood of the prosecutor roared through his veins, Dowland soon learned why so many people were hooked on Racehorse Haynes. The feisty Houston lawyer had a way of flattering the court and challenging it, all in the same sentence. The judge could see this was going to be a case unlike any he had experienced. The defense decided to write Ray Hudson, the father of Davis's girlfriend Karen Master, into their budget. His expenses would total $45,000 as a local consultant, though Cullen thought of Hudson more as a babysitter for Karen to keep her on an even keel. Cullen gave his attorneys a free hand with expenses. Haynes also decided that it would be to their advantage to order daily copies of the transcript. It was an almost unprecedented expense at $4.25 a page. Dailies could run 200 to 300 pages, but it would help with cross-examination and would force the state into a battle of bucks. Haynes reasoned correctly that when the taxpayers learned what it was costing to try Cullen Davis, sentiment would turn against the prosecution. The defense had already commissioned a $30,000 research project to determine the types of people who would make the best jurors. A similar study was done in the Patty Hearst case. Although the project hadn't spared Miss Hearst, Haynes saw enough similarities in the cases to justify the expense. What they needed, Haynes was certain, was a jury that wouldn't be prejudiced against Davis's great wealth. They needed to find jurors who were open-minded, who could understand the abstract notion of reasonable doubt, and who could tolerate long periods of isolation. Dallas psychiatrist John Holbrook, who organized the project, estimated the survey would give the defense a 5 to 10% edge in picking the jury. The report concluded, for example, that office workers would not look kindly on the defendant. Asked to rate a 25-year-old white female secretary as a prospective juror, Holbrook said she'd hang him. Haynes had also employed Dr. Margaret Covington, a psychologist trained to study prospective jurors for various traits. Pupil dilation, for example, gave evidence of deception. At least a dozen lawyers were working on various aspects of Cullen Davis's defense, but Racehorse decided they need at least two more. They needed one well-known Amarillo lawyer present in the courtroom to dispel the image of themselves as a battery of high-priced outsiders come to city slick the good folks of Potter County. And they needed a second attorney to work behind the scenes, investigating and evaluating the citizens who would be considered for jury duty. This second role was particularly important because Haynes knew that the Tarrant County prosecutors would conduct only a cursory survey, checking names on the jury list against city directories and local law enforcement files, what lawyers call the normal investigation. The edge here was psychological as well as strategic. Haynes delighted in watching the faces of the prosecuting attorneys when he turned suddenly to a panelist and asked, "Oh, by the way, Mrs. Jones, how's your uncle doing after that hernia operation?" If Racehorse could keep his poker face, this sometimes resulted in the state blowing one of its own strikes on a juror Haynes wouldn't touch with a fire extinguisher. To screen and investigate the many names on the jury list, the defense hired a well-known local attorney named Hugh Russell. Russell's job was to use his contacts as discreetly as possible to snoop into the private lives of each potential juror. On June 27, 1977, when the court reduced its original jury list to 150, Russell updated his file and moved in a high gear. Private investigators photographed jurors' homes and made notes on how well each house was maintained, its approximate sales value, the number and type of cars at the residence, signs, bumper stickers, anything that might identify the owner as a member of a fringe group. Neighbors were questioned, as were potential jurors' relatives, doctors, lawyers, barbers, even newspaper boys. "We were looking for the type of juror that the state would normally look for," Russell said. "Good, solid, basically conservative citizens who would have no affinity for Priscilla and might even find her revolting. We wanted to eliminate cranks or people who had some axe to grind. Any scrap of information might be important, might give us the edge on the state. Basically, we wanted the state to start out in the hole." Their fat dossiers had coughed up several prospects who seemed tailor-made for the cause. Haynes's job in such cases was to wear a poker face and hope the state didn't strike them, though, oddly enough, the state seemed to be looking for the same types. One of them was Alma Miller, a 64-year-old grandmother who was active in church, Girl Scouts, PTA, and the Garden Club. If Alma didn't love Cullen Davis, nobody would, and it was a safe bet she wouldn't like what she heard about Priscilla. Alma Miller was the fifth juror chosen. Juror number 6 was R.C. Hubbard, a Navy veteran and grandfather who worked with several Christian youth groups. There were times when the state's logic appeared terribly twisted. They didn't seem to understand that customs and practices that had worked for years didn't necessarily apply to this case. The defense was looking for tough citizens, while the state was striking them because they didn't look tough enough. Another lawyer observed, "You'll notice that a lot of them are overweight. Overweight people are docile and submissive. They'll hate Priscilla because of her flashy dress and her living with Stan Farr. People in Amarillo don't appreciate that sort of behavior. If they disliked Priscilla, would it follow that they would appreciate Cullen?" "Don't matter," the attorney said. "Racehorse won't let it get to that." Another Amarillo attorney, D. Miller, joined the team for the purpose of helping remind the jurors who were the good guys and who were the bad. Miller was about as good as you could get in Amarillo. All 12 jurors knew him either personally or by reputation. D and his twin brother headed one of Amarillo's most prestigious law firms, and an older brother was known to everyone in the community as the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board. D was a director of the North State Bank, past president of the Amarillo Country Club, and a cog in the local Democratic Party. One of his law partners explained, "D has a large following in town. If there's anyone in Amarillo he doesn't know personally, he knows someone who does. D's greatest talent is knowing how to make friends and keep them." Miller was regarded as an adequate criminal attorney, but his legal reputation was no factor in his selection to the Cullen Davis defense team. He questioned no witnesses, offered no objections, argued no motions. His function for the next 5 months was to be seen sitting at the defense table next to Cullen Davis. For this, D. Miller collected the largest fee of his career. The prosecutor, Shannon, was curious what the judge thought of the jury they had just finished picking. Shannon was absolutely stunned when Dowland told him, quote, "You don't have a capital case and you haven't picked a capital jury." Shannon had the creepy feeling they had committed an irrevocable blunder somewhere back in the beginning stages of the case. Shannon had felt from the start that their best shot was a straight murder charge. He didn't believe there was a jury with conviction strong enough to sentence Davis to death. If Dowland understood the good people of Amarillo nearly as well as the state had led itself to believe, they were in trouble. It had taken Prosecutor Curry less than 30 minutes to outline their case for the jury. Curry still felt they'd done the right thing, but Shannon couldn't shake the feeling that the state was in trouble. He knew one thing: the trial judge believed they'd picked the wrong jury. The women who watched the trial had driven more than 50 miles that morning, not realizing that dozens of other housewives would likewise be eaten up with curiosity. These were soap opera addicts, and they didn't miss the chance to see the real thing. They filled the courtroom and spilled into the corridors. Priscilla's guilt or innocence wasn't an issue in the case, of course, but that didn't faze the housewives, the majority of whom were already convinced that the Priscilla Davises of their experience were responsible for the evils of mankind. They saw her as a Bible-toting phony. The state called Judge Joe Eidson as its first witness. He was the judge handling the Davises' divorce case. His testimony was intended to establish the motive for the murder. Earlier that same day, the judge had increased Priscilla's alimony while she lived in Cullen's mansion with her lovers and friends and partiers and drugs and hangers-on. The judge was turned over to Haynes for cross-examination. Haynes walked quickly to the witness stand and read the divorce judge a list of 10 names. Eidson said he didn't recognize any of them. Racehorse smiled and said that was a shame because it was a list of 10 men and women, many of them known felons, who were living at the Davis mansion while Cullen and Priscilla were divorcing. Racehorse asked the judge about Stanford Farr. Eidson didn't seem to be able to place the name, so Haynes cleared it up for him. The man was living there. She was buying him things such as boots and cars and paying his business expenses. Are these circumstances for which it is necessary to increase alimony? Eidson replied that he didn't know about Stan Farr, but if he had, I might have granted the increase. I might have left it as it was, or I might have terminated it. You might have terminated it because there was no statutory authority to support continued alimony for a woman supporting another man? Haynes asked, holding his hand to his ear as though he anticipated a very soft answer. That could have been the grounds, Eidson admitted. Priscilla Davis was on the stand for 11 days. She never wore the same thing twice. Curry was pleased. No matter how many times Priscilla told the story, she told it the same way, down to the hand gestures and tears. She was a damn good witness, Curry thought. Race thought Priscilla was a little too good and objected repeatedly that the witness was expanding her answers outside the scope of the question. During his own questioning, Haynes marveled that Priscilla couldn't seem to recall how many times she had rehearsed her testimony with lawyers for the state and repeatedly referred to, quote, your version of the murders. Priscilla interrupted him at one point and blurted out, you keep saying my version. I want to make it clear that what I said is what happened. Haynes's whole case was based upon discrediting Priscilla as a person and as a witness. In the week that followed, he did that and more. Horace Copeland had been shot to death in a Fort Worth apartment only a few weeks before. The defense planned to contend that Copeland and Stan Farr had been partners in a drug deal that went sour shortly before the killings, and that Copeland had threatened to kill Farr. But for the moment, the phantom that Haynes wanted to implant in the minds of the jurors was the rogue motorcycle racer, W.T. Ruffner. The jury had already heard Ruffner's name, but didn't yet know that Ruffner had moved in shortly after Cullen moved out, and at roughly the same time of his own drug bust. Now it was time for the jury to take a look at Ruffner, and Racehorse had a dramatic visual aid, a photograph he wanted to introduce as evidence. He had it printed poster size on paper so thin that it was nearly transparent. Casually, Haynes approached the bench. As he unfurled it for the judge's inspection and displayed it so that the lights in the courtroom clearly illuminated it for the jury, all four prosecutors jumped to their feet. "You can see right through it," Tim Curry protested. "He did it deliberately." Racehorse protested his innocence, but you could see the smirk on his face. In previous testimony outside the jury's presence, Priscilla testified that she didn't recognize the picture, and on this basis, Judge Dowland refused to admit it into evidence. But the damage was done. Everyone in the jury box, in fact, everyone on that side of the courtroom, could see that the color blow-up was a picture of W.T. Ruffner and Priscilla. Priscilla wore a low-cut halter top and hip-hugger slacks, and Ruffner was buck naked, except for a candy-striped Christmas stocking covering his privates. They posed with their arms around each other. Dowland ordered that a piece of cardboard be taped to the back of the photograph before permitting Haynes to continue questioning Priscilla. Priscilla repeated that she'd never seen the picture before, and in fact believed it to be a trick manufactured to embarrass her. Haynes challenged that and asked this.
"Have you ever seen W.T. Ruffner in a social atmosphere when he was running around without his clothes on?"
"I don't recall that I have."
"You have never seen W.T. Ruffner naked as a jaybird with his you-know-what in a sock? Do you recognize the man in the photograph as W.T. Ruffner?"
"Well, I recognize the face. I don't recognize the sock."
Then Haynes probed the drug habits of Priscilla Davis. "Did you have any idea at all that the continued use of Percodan could become habituating?" Haynes asked the witness. Priscilla said she didn't. "No physician ever told you that?" "I've been told it's possible to become addicted to Excedrin. I've been told it's like anything, including alcohol, that if you overdo it, it can have bad side effects." "Have you been told Percodan is addictive?" "I've never been told I was addicted, nor am I." Judge Dowland called a recess at this point, and the prosecutors huddled with their witness in one of the back rooms. "Are you addicted to Percodan?" Curry asked Priscilla in his soft, professional voice. "Just tell the truth." Priscilla hesitated, then answered, "I guess I am." "Then don't lie about it," the district attorney told her. When Haynes resumed his questioning after the recess, Priscilla was ready to fess up.
"And are you saying that you were not addicted to the use of Percodan?"
"No, sir, I don't mean to mislead the jury."
"You are addicted to Percodan, aren't you?"
"Yes, sir, there's a possibility."
"Don't you know it to be a fact?"
"It's highly possible."
"How many Percodan were you taking a day?"
"Due to the pain from the gunshot, I was taking far more than 100 a week."
"Were you taking more than 200 a week?"
"That may be closer to it. I was having to take 4 every couple of hours."
Priscilla went on to explain that her doctors had become concerned about her addiction and had her admitted to the hospital in July, as the jury selection was proceeding in Amarillo. A local TV reporter called the trial the biggest thing to ever hit Amarillo. In every bar, restaurant, and department store, the major topic was Cullen and Priscilla. Mrs. Lozelle Graham commuted to the trial every day from her home in Lockney, which was 100 miles from Amarillo. She admitted she spent most of the time in the hallway just trying to catch a glimpse of Priscilla. "I don't have to be in the courtroom to tell you what I think," Mrs. Graham told the Dallas Morning News. "I think she's lying and Cullen is innocent." Many of the housewives had no idea who was murdered, but they could recall exactly what Priscilla wore each day. "I can't believe she was wearing a suede outfit in the middle of August," said Mrs. Donna Davis. "That's not going to help her. Not a bit." Priscilla's bodyguard was sometimes called her hitman. They had all heard about the poster-sized picture of Priscilla and that naked man, and they clustered around the courtroom artist who sketched it. Cullen himself was talking to reporters. If Priscilla was the wanton hussy that the defense lawyers were claiming, reporters wondered why Cullen married her in the first place. "Priscilla changed," he told them. "I knew she was taking a lot of drugs, but only in retrospect did I realize how seriously they had affected her. During the past year of investigation, I discovered that Priscilla had caused my home to make Sodom and Gomorrah look like Petticoat Junction." Later on, prosecutor Tim Curry said, "I thought we came up here to try a murder case. We've gone so far afield it's ridiculous." It was at this point in the trial that the press became aware of the defense's master plan. Whether accidentally or on purpose, defense lawyers conveniently left a memo on the table next to the exhibits already admitted into evidence. Reporters checked the contents of this table during recesses. According to the memo, it was the defense's plan to show: 1. Priscilla Davis knew something was about to happen that night. 2. Beverly Bass could not see who shot Gavril. 3. The person who did the shooting was in fact after Stan Farr and did not intend to shoot Priscilla. Confronted with the memo, Phil Burleson, for the defense, admitted to reporters that the memo was substantially correct and that the defense also planned to prove that there was a conspiracy between at least 2 people to put the blame on Cullen Davis. Burleson wasn't yet ready to name the 2 conspirators, but it was obvious that he meant Priscilla and Bev Bass. Later on, Haynes asked Priscilla about the .357 Magnum that Stan Farr carried in his Black Thunderbird. Didn't this indicate he feared for his life? Priscilla replied that Farr only carried the pistol when he transported large sums of money for the Rhinestone Cowboy bar. Racehorse treated the jury to his mystic smile then. He wanted them to remember this later when he developed the fact that the pistol was still in Farr's car on the night of the murder, several weeks after he was terminated from his job at the Rhinestone Cowboy. Although he didn't admit it at the time, even Racehorse Haynes agreed that Priscilla made a better witness than he anticipated. Quote, "I thought it was a stroke of genius the way Tim Curry handled her," Haynes said later. "He brought her to the end in super style. I'd have to give him an A."